Hello and welcome to Academic Matters at Salle University. I'm Brian Goldstein, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. It's my pleasure today to welcome Assistant Professor of Nutrition, Robin Danowski. Welcome, Robin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's start with a little bit about your background, your professional journey, and what inspired you to come to LaSalle.
Okay, well, I am originally from North Carolina, born and raised in the Greensboro area. I did my undergraduate degree at East Carolina University, where I received a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics. And after that, I applied for a dietetic internship. And I applied to a lot of different places. I wanted to travel and see as much of the US as possible. So I applied for Jacksonville, Florida, Mayo Clinic internship, and I received it. I'm lucky. And went down there and I had my clinical experience, my food service experience, as well as community nutrition experience. And that enabled me to sit for the RD exam. And once I passed the registered dietetic exam, I moved back to Virginia area where I had my first clinical dietetic job. I ended up working at Virginia Beach General Hospital for close to 8 years. I worked in all areas of the hospital, anywhere from working with cardiac patients to oncology patients. My favorite area in the hospital was the intensive care unit, working with adults, helping administer tube feedings and TPN, writing orders, being a part of the nutrition support team. And I also was lucky enough to be able to work in the NICU with the tiny little babies, the neonates, and help them make sure they got adequate nutrition for growth. And once I did that, I decided to go back and get my Master's of Science in Community Health. I was really interested in the health of the overall patient. Of course, I love nutrition, and I think nutrition is really important for the health of most people, but I think that looking at the overall health is really important too. So I received my degree in community health, and then at Old Dominion University. And then with my travels, ended up on the West Coast for a little while with my family, and then moved to Philadelphia area, where my husband got a job. And so that is what landed me here. We were only going to be here for about 2 years, but I really enjoyed living in the Philadelphia area. I started off at LaSalle as an adjunct professor, and I really found my love of teaching matched my love of nutrition, and it was a perfect way to combine the two. So I hung around a little bit, didn't leave, came back semester after semester until there was a job available for a full-time faculty member. And then I landed here, and I've been a full-time faculty member for about 2 years now.
So talk a little bit, Robin, about the courses that you teach here at LaSalle and how you bridge the chasm between basic science and theory and research and application, because it's my experience that often students want to know exactly what they're going to do with this information. So how do you bridge those gaps in the courses that you teach?
Sure. So I've taught Principles of Nutrition, which is our 100-level course with all the basic applications of nutrition for lifestyle and chronic disease. And I've also taught life cycle nutrition, which goes through the different nutrition requirements through the stages of the life cycle and how that changes and how the priorities change. I teach medical nutrition therapy to juniors, and I teach the medical nutrition therapy 1 and medical nutrition therapy 2 that really focuses in on each individual disease state and how nutrition is affected by those and how those diseases affect nutritional status. I also work with our dietetic interns as a part of our coordinated program, and I've taught the clinical portion of their assignment as well as the community portion. And what's different about the clinical and community portions of the coordinated program is not only do they receive a lecture about different topics related to nutrition, but they also receive actual field experience. So as a instructor or professor in that curriculum, I actually help with the lectures as well as go to sites and visit our students and make sure that they're learning what they need to learn and make sure the preceptors who are so generous of their time are actually getting what they need from the students. It's a win-win. So that kind of brings in the next question that you asked as far as how do we bridge the gap here? So it's really important in the nutrition program that they get the content. I mean, that's required for passing the RD exam. I mean, that's just a basic thing we need to do. But I also believe in bringing in real-world relevant experiences. So I feel lucky enough to have had the opportunity to work as a clinical dietitian for so long, and also as a renal dietitian, not only in the hospital, but also in a dialysis center, where I can bring in a lot of those situations into the classroom, which not only helps them take the material and apply it to real life experience, but also to engage them. And I find that the students really do respond well when they get to see a real life situation and what happened and how nutrition plays out, and then of course how important their role is as a dietitian. And I think it's important really to bring that in. And we also talk about in medical nutrition therapy, as well as in community and clinical nutrition, teaching them about research, teaching them about how to really read and understand a peer-reviewed article and how to apply that to their clinical application. So there's a lot of different ways in which we do that. We have them do journal club reviews. We actually have them present on lectures. So one of the new things we're doing this year in medical nutrition therapy is having each of the students pick a hot nutrition topic that they're really interested in. Of course, it has to be medical nutrition based, and they're presenting their research, well, not their personal research, but research that they have read about and become the expert in, and they're presenting this to the students in a very scientific way, and as well as in a way that dietitians can really gain a lot of knowledge from that as well.
So you mentioned ensuring that students understand the evidence base for nutrition and health in general. So this is a question about misperceptions or misconceptions. When your students come into their first nutrition classes, what are some of their misperceptions or misconceptions about nutrition generally? And then also talk about the public's misunderstanding and misconception about nutrition and health more generally.
Well, they're very similar, but yet they do have some differences. So first, the student's perception of nutrition is that it's going to be relatively easy and quick to understand, and it's all about diet and weight loss. And well, there is a strong component of diet and weight loss, but that's not the only thing that we cover. We actually deal a lot with malnutrition, which is the opposite end of trying to lose weight. We actually spend a lot of time in the hospital setting helping patients to increase their nutritional status. We're dealing with patients who have lots of weight loss, who have muscle wasting, whose lab work is really going downhill based on their chronic disease status. So we often incorporate that into our teachings as well. A misconception about the public, well, I guess one could be that carbohydrates are bad. Well, another could be, which is not true, it all depends on what type of carbohydrate you consume. And another thing is that always sticks in my mind is that dietitians never eat junk food. Dietitians never have French fries, which is not true. We definitely engage in all sorts of eating. It's all about moderation and timing of meals as well.
So expand on that a little bit, because you mentioned carbohydrates, and it seems like every week we read about another fad, quote unquote, diet, as opposed to perhaps eating in a way that maintains a healthy lifestyle. So what are some tips that you have for perhaps staying away from the fad diets, but thinking more about healthy eating and nutrition and health most generally?
I think the first thing that I would say about low carb diets, which low carbohydrate diets are very common. There's the Atkins diet, there is the Whole30 diet, there's the new ketogenic diet, which all really stress low, extremely low carbohydrate levels, moderate protein and high fat. And we need carbohydrates for energy. They're our body's preferred energy source. So it's never a good idea when you're reading through different diet plans to pick ones that eliminate entire food groups, because you're increasing your risk for nutrient deficiencies, as well as fatigue and regaining weight at the end of your experiment, so to speak. They're really hard to stick to long term. So I think that using the USDA's MyPlate is a really good place to start for basic guidance on healthy eating. And then reading food labels. There's a new food label coming out. Well, it's supposed to be in the summer of 2018. They may actually push it back to 2020. But it really emphasizes serving sizes, which are important to pay attention to, as well as calorie needs.
So you mentioned a new food label that's potentially coming out, let's say within the next 2 years. So it would seem that students and the public need to pay attention to those food labels in order to maintain healthy eating lifestyle. What is it about the food label specifically that we ought to be looking for?
Well, first of all, some companies have already rolled out the new food label, so you will see it on a lot of packaged goods. It's just not required yet for all food companies or food manufacturing companies to have it. But one of the great changes, or several of the great changes to the new food label are first serving size. That's one of the main things I had a problem with the previous food label is, say if you like ice cream, which I love ice cream, that's kind of my downfall. A serving size of ice cream is a half a cup. And I don't know too many people who sit down and have ice cream and only have a half a cup of ice cream.
Which is about the size of the
palm of your hand,
right?
Right, exactly.
That's not enough ice cream.
It's not enough ice cream. And it can be very misleading if you were to look and figure, okay, this is my typical serving size of ice cream. I'm going to look on the label and see how many calories this is. And you may see, oh, it's only 150 calories. But are you aware that your serving that you decided to consume is actually 3 times that amount? So the serving sizes are now more realistic, which I think can be really helpful to help people understand exactly how many calories, how much fat. And also they've added sugars, which is really important because I think that can be confusing under the carbohydrate label, which is carbohydrate or natural sugar, and what is the added sugar? Because the added sugars are really not needed in our diet, and we want to minimize that to less than 10% of total calories.
So since, at least at the time that we're talking, the Broad Street Run is upcoming, the weather's starting to become nicer. What do you recommend for sort of weekend outdoor athletes, runners, bikers, swimmers, et cetera, in terms of nutrition intake both before and after, let's say, rigorous working out?
Sure. So it really depends on what type of workout you're doing, or how long your workout is, or how rigorous or vigorous your activity is. In general, maintaining your fluid status is the most important. So I would say making sure that you're getting enough fluid before and after. You really don't need any sort of sports drinks unless you're exercising longer than 1 hour. So I would say water for the first hour, sports drinks possibly for the second hour, especially if you're doing the Broad Street Run, to help replace those electrolytes. It's also important too, if you're exercising longer than an hour, you may need to replenish your carbohydrate intake. So that's important, maybe every 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate, which is 1 to 2 servings of carbohydrate after an hour time period. So hydration, carbohydrates as your preferred energy source are the 2 main things I would focus on.
Thank you very much. Our guest for this segment was Robin Danowski, Assistant Professor in the Nutrition Program. Thank you for joining us, Robin.
Thank you.
Wake each morning and get lost in the adventure, knowing that you will be ready for wherever the day takes you. Learn from those willing to teach. Their wisdom and their strength will become yours. They will impart to you a tradition of education nationally recognized for its value. A tradition worthy of your best efforts. As young men and women of LaSalle, we will invest in you the guidance to blaze your own path. To go forth into the unknown with new certainty. To realize your full potential as professionals, as leaders, as citizens. To take up your place as the accountants, speech therapists, journalists, and CEOs of your generation. To impact this city and the world beyond. These adventures are yours, and you are ready for them. Explorers are never lost.
Welcome back to Academic Matters at LaSalle University. I'm Brian Goldstein, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Liz Langemak, Associate Professor in the Department of English, to Academic Matters. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with what inspired you to come to LaSalle, and maybe a little bit about your background and how you ended up here at the university.
Sure, yeah. So I'm from Waldo, Wisconsin, originally. It's a very small town. I'm actually from outside of a small town of 400 people. And so I went to college in Green Bay, Wisconsin, at St. Norbert College, and I studied English there. And then from there, I went straight out to Boston University, and I did a master's degree in poetry writing, during which time I figured out that if I wanted to write poetry, then I would need to read more. And so I applied to do a second master's degree at the University of Missouri, and that ended up being a master's PhD. And when I finished the master's, I flipped over to a creative PhD. And so I finished my work up there. And from there, I moved to Bethany, West Virginia, another small place, and I taught at Bethany College for 2 years before coming out here. And so one of the things that I really like, I like small places, and so when I had come out here to visit, this seemed like a small place that was also a big place. And so I had the sense of like everybody, not everybody knowing each other, but something similar. And so it felt very comfortable, but also it felt like there was possibility for expansion here. And so it made me feel very comfortable.
So you mentioned in your short bio that you are a poet and that you write poetry, and that is your, if you will, scholarship as we talk about at the university. So I'd like you to read a poem that resonated with me instantly when I read it. And so if you wouldn't mind reading it, and then I want to talk about the poem.
Sure, absolutely. It's called On I-76 East. Cows on the hillside like statues of cows. Windmills cartwheeling nowhere. I'm driving toward you again, and Monday I'll return this way. All this movement required for things not to change, like all those small breaths required for sleep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So talk about what inspired you to write this particular poem, and then maybe a little bit about the process that you went through for this specific one.
Sure, yeah. So it's not a poem about anything too deep. It's a poem about a long-distance relationship. And so
I thought it was about being stuck in traffic, and that's why the title resonated with me, as it probably does with many viewers.
Sure. No, it's about the 5.5 hours between Bethany, West Virginia and Philadelphia, which is where the man who would become my husband was living at the time when I was in West Virginia. And so, you know, on a 5.5 hour drive, you've got a long time to think. And so I think, I mean, one of the things that matters to me about poetry are images. And so it's a lot of windmills, a lot of cows. And so thinking about the sort of like the language and the possible imagery around those, I think I wrote that poem at a time in which I was really interested in experimenting with short forms. And so I was interested in working on really small images that would then resonate with the reader however he or she wanted it to. Like, it doesn't matter to me that, to me, that's a poem about a long distance relationship, but to someone else, it's maybe about being stuck in traffic, and I think that's fine.
So that engenders a couple questions for me, which is specifically about the process that you typically go through when you do write, given that we're more comfortable and used to perhaps writing longer form pieces in school, you know, expository essays. So what's it like to be a poet? Do you have certain times you sit down and write, and how do you get inspired? And what happens when you just look at the paper and sort of nothing emanates?
Yeah, so what I've learned over the years, so what it's like to be a poet is I think what it's like to be any other sort of writer. It's hard, and there are times when nothing happens, a lot of times when nothing happens, and that what I've learned to do, when I was younger, I would sit down to write when I felt inspired, and that maybe worked, maybe when I had lots of free time, and it was fine for a while. But what I've learned as I've become more practiced is that I need to set aside time, specific time. And so writers call it showing up, right? And so you show up to the desk and you show up for 2 hours at a time or so maybe, and then you wait. And if nothing happens, then it's okay. And so you can force yourself to sort of start writing a couple words, just like I tell my composition students, that's absolutely fine. Just try to make yourself write something. And then as far as inspiration, again, when I was younger, it used to be more about ideas. My husband, who is also a poet, and I used to have this argument about whether poems were made of words or ideas. And it used to be, way back when, that he took the position that poems were made of words, and I thought that poems were made of ideas, and that I was more interested in what would make me, what I thought was important to write about. And as I've gotten older, I don't always like to tell him that he's right, but he was right about this one, I think. And so I start with language. I start with phrases or words that I think are interesting, and then I piece together where the poem goes from there. I find that the best writing happens when I don't know where it's going to end.
So a poem like On I-76 East, is that something that took an hour, 3 hours, 10 hours? And how many drafts do you think you went through before you had something that you were willing to send to a publisher?
Sure. That one probably took me a little less long. That one probably only took me a month or two. And so, I mean, some poems are quicker than others, just like everything else. I find that the time in which I'd like a poem to be finished is always shorter than when it actually is finished. Like everyone else, I would like to sit down and produce something awesome and then be done.
So it's rare that maybe in your world it's different, but in my world, I don't have friends who say, you know, I'm ready to go to the beach, and so I'm going to buy a new book of poetry to go read at the beach. Why is it that poetry for many is not regularly consumed, fun, leisurely reading?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of reasons. I think the easy answer is that it's about, people have bad experiences maybe in high school or something like that. But I think that's not necessarily true. I think if people have bad experiences in high school, it's because their teachers had bad experiences being taught poetry as well. I think, right, we're used to writing prose. Fiction, nonfiction, all forms of that, even drama, right? The line moves to the end of the page and then it kicks over. And poetry depends heavily on the line, which then requires a vocabulary in order to be able to discuss it or to know what you're doing with it. And lots of people just aren't familiar with that, and so it makes people nervous.
So how then would you suggest to more neophytes about how to approach, appreciate, and be a regular consumer of poetry in a way that is perhaps less intimidating? Or less intimidating than we might think it is?
Sure. Well, what I always do with my 150 classes, and so the Introduction to Literature courses, with people who have maybe never read poetry really seriously before, the first thing we do is we think about sentences. I think it was Ezra Pound who said that poetry has a responsibility to be as well written as prose. And so, right, if you break it into sentences, people can read those. And it's very, very different than with the line. And so that's the easiest thing to do. Read things as a sentence. Don't worry about form. And then after that, if you're interested, then approach the form from there. But you should be able to get the content.
So you mentioned words and content and form, and I'm interested, given your background and the number of places that you've lived, both small, really small, and also large Philadelphia, has your work changed based on geography, place, people, and how?
I think my work has changed, but I don't know if it's because of the different places that I've moved. When I was in grad school in Boston, Derek Walcott was my teacher, and he said, he claimed at the time, he spent a lot of time talking about how everyone's poetry, you needed to understand that you were from a home, a certain home, and your work needed to reflect that. And at the time, when I was 21, I didn't know what that meant. And now I see that I've become more familiar, even as I go other places, more familiar with and more comfortable with where I'm from and what I know really well. And I think it's a metaphor for returning to the topics that you understand really well. And so I think my poetry has changed. I hope that it has since I was 21. But I think not necessarily because I'm in a new place.
So I'm wondering if one of those inspirations is your fairly young daughter, and how that's changed your inspiration and your work and your approach to your work, having a fairly young child running around the house now. Literally running around
Literally,
the house.
yeah. So a lot of my poems for a time period were about her, and then they were about mothering, and I tried to make them not just about me, but I tried to think about other mothers and other experiences of mothering in my life as well. It influenced my work schedule. It influenced, I mean, everything regarding to time, as you know, and so it forced me to make time for writing, whereas before I could maybe even still sort of wait on inspiration. But it rearranged my life in a way that was maybe hard at first, but for the best, in that now I have very, very specific times that I write.
Are you able to do that as she's sort of toddling around the
Oh
house?
no, I leave the house.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as we approach spring into summer, we're talking about beach reading. May I ask you to make a couple of poetry recommendations for us for some summer reading?
Yeah, of course. Let me think. I have just ordered Sharon Olds' recent collection, Odes, which I think will be really interesting. There's a couple other poets who I'm interested in taking a look at. Ross Gay has a new collection, and also Ocean Vuong's new collection.
Great. Liz Langemak, thank you for joining us on Academic Matters. Thank you all for joining us today here at Salle University on Academic Matters.